The valley had no name worth remembering. It existed as a crease in the Montana Territory, a place where the mountains pressed close enough to make a man feel both protected and trapped. The town that squatted at its center went by Sweetwater on maps that bothered to include it, though there was nothing sweet about the alkaline creek that trickled through its heart, and precious little water come summer. It was the kind of place men came to when they were running from something or toward nothing in particular. Colt Rayner rode in on an October afternoon when the aspens had turned the color of old gold, and the air carried that peculiar Rocky Mountain sharpness that warned of winter's approach. His horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Rust, picked its way down the rutted excuse for a main street with the careful gait of an animal that had seen too many towns just like this one. Colt himself cut an unremarkable figure, 32 years old, weather-beaten in the way of men who lived outdoors more than in, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water under clouded skies. He wore a duster that had once been brown but had faded to the shade of drought-stricken earth, and he carried a Colt Peacemaker on his hip more out of habit than expectation of use. He hadn't planned on stopping in Sweetwater. Then again, he rarely planned much of anything anymore. The town consisted of perhaps 24 structures scattered along both sides of the creek, connected by a bridge that swayed alarmingly under wagon traffic. On the north side stood the more permanent establishments, a general store with a false front that aspired to grandeur it couldn't achieve, a boarding house with paint peeling like sunburned skin, and a saloon called the Lucky Dollar that looked like it had never seen a dollar lucky or otherwise. The south side housed the working parts of town, a livery stable, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, a feed store, and a collection of smaller enterprises that came and went with the seasons and the fortunes of whoever ran them. Colt guided Russ toward the livery. The stable appeared reasonably maintained, which mattered more than most things when a man's life might depend on his horse's readiness. A boy of perhaps 14 emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on trousers that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a matter of speculation. "Help you, mister?" The boy's voice cracked on the second word, betraying his position in that awkward country between childhood and whatever came next. "Horse needs tending." Colt dismounted with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many consecutive days in the saddle. "Grain if you have it, water, a rub-down." "Got all three." The boy reached for Rust's reins with capable hands. "Staying long?" "Just passing through." The boy nodded as if he'd heard that particular song before. "That's what most folks say. Half of them end up staying anyway. Valley has a way of holding people." "Not me." Colt pulled his saddlebags free and slung them over his shoulder. "Boarding house have rooms?" "Mrs. Harmon's does. Across the bridge, north side. Can't miss it. Only building painted yellow, though she calls it cream." The boy began leading Russ toward a stall. "Fair warning, though. Town's stirred up right now. Might want to keep your head down." Colt paused. "Stirred up how?" The boy glanced toward the street, then back. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something more guarded. "Mr. Dalton owns the big ranch north of here. He got killed 2 nights ago, him and some of his cattle. Folks are mighty upset about it." "They catch who did it?" "Not yet, but they got some ideas." The way the boy said it made Colt's instincts prickle. "Like I said, mister, keep your head down." Colt crossed the bridge as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The creek below ran shallow and clear, revealing rounded stones in its bed like scattered thoughts. On the far bank, he could see the boarding house the boy had mentioned, a 2-story structure that might once have been handsome before weather and neglect had their way with it. The doors stood open to catch what remained of the day's warmth. Colt knocked on the frame and waited. Come in, come in. Don't be shy." The voice belonged to a woman who appeared from a doorway to his left, wiping flour-dusted hands on an apron. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that assessed him with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd sized up strangers for a living. "You'll be wanting a room, I expect?" "If you have one." "Got 3 empty. Take your pick of the second floor. $1 a night, includes breakfast and supper if you're here for it. $2 if you want a bath drawn." She tilted her head slightly. "You look like a man who could use a bath." Despite everything, Colt felt his mouth quirk upward. "That obvious?" "Honey, I run a boarding house in a mining territory. I've seen men come through here who'd make you look fresh as Sunday morning." She gestured toward a narrow staircase. "Second door on the right's the cleanest. Name's Iris Harmon. Colt Rayner." He started toward the stairs, then paused. "Boy at the livery mentioned some trouble. Rancher got killed." The lightness drained from Iris Harmon's face like water from a broken vessel. "Jacob Dalton. Good man. Honest man. Didn't deserve what happened to him." "What did happen?" She glanced toward the open door, then moved to close it despite the loss of light. When she turned back, her voice had dropped. 2 nights ago, someone raided his ranch, killed him, and 2 of his hands made off with near 100 head of cattle. Left his wife a widow and his 3 children without a father. Anyone see who did it? That's just it. No one saw clear. It was dark, happened fast. But folks have their suspicions. She crossed her arms. And in a town like this, suspicions spread faster than facts. Who are they suspecting? Strangers, drifters, anyone who doesn't have roots deep enough to prove they belong. Her eyes held his. Anyone, Mr. Rayner, like you. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Colt kept his expression neutral. "I just rode in an hour ago." "I know that. I believe you. But there's a difference between knowing and believing on one hand, and what a frightened town does on the other." She moved past him to light a lamp against the gathering dusk. "My advice? Get your rest tonight, move on in the morning. This valley's about to get ugly, and it won't care much about who deserves what." Colt climbed the stairs to his room, her words echoing in his head. The room itself was exactly what he'd expected. Narrow bed with a thin mattress, washstand with a chipped basin, single window that overlooked the street. Clean enough, sparse enough, temporary enough. He'd stayed in 100 rooms just like it across a dozen territories. He dropped his saddlebags on the bed and moved to the window. From this vantage point, he could see a good portion of Sweetwater's main street. The sun had dropped below the western peaks now, painting the valley in shades of purple and gold. Lamps were being lit in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. It could have been any frontier town settling in for an ordinary evening. But it wasn't. Colt could feel it, that electric quality in the air that came before storms or violence. He'd felt it before in other towns, other situations. It was the sensation of something wound too tight, ready to snap. He should leave in the morning, just like Iris Harmon suggested. This wasn't his town, wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in local troubles brought nothing but grief. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. Not yet. Not without understanding what he'd stumbled into. Because there was something else in the air too, something the boy at the livery had hinted at, and Iris Harmon had confirmed, the smell of a hunt. And Colt knew from experience that when men went hunting with more fear than facts, innocent people tended to get caught in the crossfire. He'd seen it happen. Hell, he'd been part of making it happen, once upon a time, in another valley not so different from this one. That was why he drifted now. Why he never stayed long enough to put down roots. Why he kept moving, always moving, as if distance could outrun memory. Downstairs, the boarding house door opened and closed. Voices drifted up. Iris Harmon and someone else, a man whose tone carried authority and agitation in equal measure. Colt moved closer to his door, listening. "Can't just take matters into your own hands, Martin. That's not how civilized people—" "Civilized?" The man's voice cracked like a whip. "Jacob Dalton was my friend, Iris. They shot him down like a dog and stole his cattle while his family slept not 50 yards away. You want to talk to me about civilization? I want to talk to you about law. About waiting for the territorial marshal instead of forming a— The marshal's 3 days away at best. Those men could be in Canada by then. We have an opportunity right now, and by heaven, I intend to take it." Colt opened his door a crack. From the landing, he could see down into the boarding house's main room. Iris Harmon stood with her back to the cold fireplace, facing a man in his late 40s with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He wore a suit that spoke of town respectability, probably a merchant or possibly the mayor if Sweetwater had one. "What opportunity?" Iris asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and dreaded it. "We found them. 3 men camped up in Miller's Canyon with a string of horses and no good explanation for where they're headed or where they came from." The man, Martin, paced as he spoke, energy radiating from him like heat from a stove. One of them matches the description Jackson gave before he died. Dark-bearded, scar on his left hand. The timing fits perfect. Jackson was delirious from blood loss. You can't rely on, it's more than we had this morning. Martin stopped pacing and faced her squarely. Look, I know you don't approve. I know you think we should wait, follow proper procedure, let the law handle it. But Jacob was my friend. His wife came to me today with her children, asking what we're going to do. What was I supposed to tell her? That we'll wait patiently while the men who murdered her husband disappear into the wilderness? Iris's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. I'm telling you to be certain before you do something you can't undo. That's all. Just be certain. We will be. We're bringing them in for questioning, not stringing them up in the street. Martin moved toward the door. But if they did this thing, Iris, if they killed Jacob and those boys, then this town will see justice done, one way or another. He left without waiting for a response. Iris stood alone in the lamplight for a long moment, her shoulders sagging as if under great weight. Then she seemed to gather herself, straightening with visible effort before moving deeper into the house. Colt closed his door softly and returned to the window. In the street below, men were gathering. Not all at once, but in ones and twos, emerging from the saloon and the general store and the houses scattered throughout town. They carried rifles and lanterns, and they moved with the purposeful unity of a forming posse. Martin appeared among them, and the group coalesced around him like iron filings to a magnet. Colt counted 15 men, maybe 20. Hard to tell in the failing light. They spoke in voices too low to carry, but their body language told the story. Anger, determination, that dangerous cocktail of grief and righteousness that made men capable of things they'd never consider in calmer moments. The posse mounted up and rode north out of town, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the gathering dark. Colt stood at the window long after they disappeared, trying to talk himself out of the decision he could feel himself making. It wasn't his business. These weren't his people. Whatever happened in Miller's Canyon tonight would happen whether he involved himself or not. But he kept seeing Martin's face, hearing the certainty in his voice, kept thinking about descriptions given by dying men and opportunities that fit too perfectly, kept remembering another town, another posse, another night when men had been so certain they were right. He grabbed his duster and headed for the stairs. Iris Harmon intercepted him at the bottom. Where do you think you're going? For a walk. In the same direction as an armed posse. Her eyes narrowed. I took you for smarter than that, Mr. Rayner. Then you took me wrong. He moved toward the door. They'll be suspicious of any stranger right now. You ride after them, they're liable to... I'm not riding after them. I'm just going to see what happens. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. Someone should. Someone who's not part of whatever they're about to do. Why you? It was a fair question. Colt didn't have a good answer, so he settled for the truth. Because I've been on the other side of it. The side that gets hunted based on suspicions and descriptions from dying men. I know how that story ends. He left before she could respond. The livery boy was bedding down for the night when Colt arrived. The kid looked up with surprise that quickly turned to wariness. Changed your mind about leaving? Need my horse. Posse just rode out. You weren't part of it. I'm not now either. Just going to follow at a distance. Colt moved toward Rust's stall. The gelding nickered softly, recognizing him. How far is Miller's Canyon? The boy hesitated, loyalty to town warring with something else in his expression. Finally, he said, About an hour's ride north, follows the creek up into the high country. There's an old prospector's camp there, abandoned mostly. Mostly? Drifters use it sometimes, hunters, folks passing through. The boy handed Colt his tack. The men thereafter, they didn't do nothing to me. One of them, the older fella, he helped me fix a broken wheel on the feed cart this morning. Didn't ask for nothing, just did it because it needed doing. Colt paused in the act of tightening his saddle's girth. What'd he look like? 50, maybe older. Dark beard going gray, talked educated-like, you know? Used words that weren't quite normal, but weren't fancy either. Had a young guy with him, couldn't be more than 19. And another man who didn't speak much English. That's 3 men. Yes, sir. The posse's looking for 3 men. I know. The boy's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. That's why I'm telling you, because sometimes the math adds up wrong, you know? Sometimes 3 men at the right place at the right time equals guilty, even when it shouldn't. Colt swung into the saddle. What's your name, son? Timothy. Tim Marsh. Tim, if anyone asks, you tried to talk me out of this. Understand? The boy nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. I surely did try. The ride north took Colt through country that grew progressively rougher. The valley narrowed, the mountains pressing closer on either side, until the stars seemed like distant chips of ice impossibly far overhead. The creek he followed twisted and turned, its voice growing louder as the gradient increased. He kept Russ to a walk, staying far enough behind the posse that their lantern light appeared only occasionally through the trees. No point in catching up. He wasn't there to join them. He just needed to see what happened, to understand whether his instincts were right or whether he was projecting old ghosts onto a situation that didn't warrant them. Miller's Canyon opened up suddenly, a wide spot in the valley where the creek pooled before continuing its descent. In the moonlight, Colt could make out the remains of sluice boxes and the collapsed frame of what had once been a cabin. A more recent camp occupied the center of the clearing, a canvas tent, a fire ring with embers still glowing, and a string of horses tied to a picket line. The posse had already arrived. Their lanterns created pools of harsh light that carved the clearing into stark contrasts of illumination and shadow. Men surrounded the camp, rifles raised, while 3 figures stood near the dying fire with their hands visible. Colt dismounted and tied Russ to a tree well back from the clearing. He moved forward on foot, using the darkness in the trees for cover, until he could hear voices. Martin's voice rang out, authoritative and hard. Your names and what you're doing in this valley. I already told your men. This voice belonged to an older man, cultured despite the circumstances. My name is Elias Boone. This is my hired hand, Toby Hale, and our companion whose name you wouldn't be able to pronounce even if he shared it. We're traveling to Oregon Territory, following the creek routes to avoid the higher passes before winter sets in. Convenient story. It's the truth. Elias remained calm, but Colt could hear the thread of concern beneath the words. We've broken no laws, harmed no one. We're simply passing through, same as hundreds of others do every season. 2 nights ago, Jacob Dalton was murdered and his cattle stolen. You know anything about that? I know what you just told me, which is the first I've heard of it. Elias spread his hands slightly, a gesture of openness. I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but we had nothing to do with it. One of the other posse members spoke up. Jackson said the man who shot him had a dark beard and a scar on his left hand. You got both. I have a beard, yes, and I cut my hand on a saw 3 weeks ago. Elias held up his left hand. Even from a distance, Colt could see the fresh scar across the palm. I'm a carpenter by trade. Scars come with the profession. As for the beard, half the men in this territory wear them. It's hardly identifying. Where were you 2 nights ago? Martin asked. Camped about 15 miles south of here, near a place the locals called Widow's Creek. We spoke to a homesteader that evening, traded some tobacco for fresh bread. His name was Henderson, I believe. Older gentleman with a limp. Convenient. Real convenient. Martin's skepticism came through clearly. You got any proof of that? Only my word and the hope that you'll verify it with Mr. Henderson. Elias's voice remained level, but Colt heard the tension increasing. Gentlemen, I understand you're angry and grieving, but accusation without evidence is, we got evidence. We got you here, at the right time, matching the description, with no good reason for being in this valley. Our reason is Oregon. Our timing is autumn, like every other traveler trying to beat the snow. And the description you're working from came from a dying man who might have seen his attacker for seconds in the dark. Elias took a step forward, and immediately 4 rifles came up. He froze. Please, we're innocent men. Don't compound tragedy with injustice. Colt's hands clenched at his sides. He'd heard this conversation before, or variations of it. The calm protestations of innocence. The immovable certainty of the accusers. The way fear and grief could harden into something that looked like righteousness but was really just collective need for someone to blame. He should intervene. Step out of the shadows and add his voice to reason's side. But he'd learned the hard way that a stranger's voice meant nothing to men in this state. Less than nothing. It made you suspect too. And there were 20 of them, and 1 of him. And his presence would change nothing except possibly getting him killed alongside the accused. So he stayed hidden and hated himself for it. Martin conferred quietly with several other men. The three prisoners stood in tense silence. The young one, Toby, visibly trembling despite obvious efforts at control. The foreign man remained impassive, though his eyes tracked the movement of every rifle. Finally, Martin turned back to Elias. "Here's what's going to happen. You're coming back to town with us. We'll hold you until the marshal arrives. Let him sort this out proper-like. You cooperate, you'll be treated fairly." "And if we refuse?" Elias asked quietly. "Then we'll assume you got something to hide and treat you accordingly." Martin's tone left no room for negotiation. "Your choice." It wasn't a choice, and everyone there knew it. Elias looked at his companions, seemed to come to some internal decision, and nodded. "We'll come peacefully, but I'm asking you, as one civilized man to another, to verify our story before you do anything irreversible." "We'll do our due diligence," Martin said, though his tone suggested the verdict was already in. The posse bound the three men's hands and confiscated their weapons. They doused the camp's fire and gathered up the prisoners' belongings with the casual efficiency of men who decided ownership no longer mattered. Then they mounted up, 2 men assigned to guard each prisoner, and began the ride back to Sweetwater. Colt waited until they were well gone before returning to Rust. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, staring at the now empty clearing. The moon had risen higher, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The creek continued its eternal conversation with the stones. The mountains stood as they had for millennia, indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures that scrambled across their slopes. Nothing he'd seen proved the 3 men innocent, but nothing proved them guilty either, and that was the problem. In a court of law, with a judge and proper procedure, maybe the truth would emerge. But Sweetwater didn't have a judge, and it had Martin and his grief-stricken posse and a dead rancher who needed avenging. Colt knew how that story ended too. He rode back to town slowly, taking a different route that brought him in from the east rather than following the posse's trail. By the time he returned, the main street was alive with activity despite the late hour. Word had spread that the prisoners had been brought in, and people emerged from their homes to see them. Colt stayed in the shadows, watching. The 3 men were marched to the town's only substantial structure built of stone, what looked like it might have been a bank once, but now served as a combination general store and apparently impromptu jail. The building had a root cellar with a heavy door that could be barred from outside, not designed as a jail, but functional enough for temporary confinement. The crowd that gathered was mostly men, though a few women stood at the edges. Their faces held a mixture of emotions: anger, satisfaction, curiosity, and in a few cases something that looked like doubt. But the doubters remained quiet, their uncertainty no match for the collective certainty of the majority. A woman pushed through the crowd, and the people parted for her. She wore widow's black and carried herself with the rigid control of someone holding grief at arm's length through sheer force of will. Behind her came 3 children, stair-step in age from perhaps 12 down to 6. Martin moved to intercept her. "Sarah, you don't need to Don't tell me what I need." Her voice cut through the night air like a blade. "I need to see the men who killed my husband." She stopped in front of Elias Boone. The older man met her eyes steadily, and Colt saw something flash across his face. Not guilt, but profound sorrow. "I didn't kill your husband, ma'am," Elias said quietly. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I had no part in it." Sarah Dalton stared at him for a long moment. Then, without warning, she slapped him across the face with enough force that the sound carried across the silent street. "Liar!" she hissed. "Murderer!" Elias didn't respond. He simply stood there, a red mark blooming on his cheek, while Sarah Dalton gathered her children and walked away with her head high and her spine straight and her grief contained for a few minutes longer. The crowd began to disperse, satisfaction achieved through the proxy of Sarah's slap. The prisoners were taken into the stone building, and the heavy door of the root cellar was barred behind them. Colt made his way back to the boarding house. Iris Harmon was still awake, sitting in the main room with a cup of tea grown cold in her hands. "You saw?" she asked without preamble. "I saw." "What do you think?" Colt moved to the window, looking out at the now quiet street. "I think a dying man gave a description that could fit 1,000 people. I think grief makes people certain when they should be doubtful. And I think those 3 men are probably innocent." "Probably?" "I wasn't there when Dalton died. I don't know for certain. Nobody does except the men who did it. He turned to face her. But I know the shape of this. I've seen it before. And it usually ends badly for whoever's convenient to blame. Iris set down her teacup with a careful precision that spoke of controlled emotion. There's a man in this town named Samuel Reed. He's a school teacher, one of the few educated men we have. He spoke up tonight, tried to counsel patience and proper procedure. They shouted him down. Will he try again? Probably. Sam's stubborn that way. But stubbornness doesn't count for much against a mob that's already decided. She looked at Colt with an expression that held both challenge and plea. Someone needs to stand with him. Someone needs to be a voice for waiting, for verification, for doing this right instead of fast. Why me? Because you're an outsider. You don't have a stake in local politics or friendships or grudges. Your opinion can't be dismissed as easily as Sam's can. She stood, moving closer. And because I think you know what happens if we don't. I can see it in your eyes. You've been somewhere like this before. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I was part of a posse once, in Colorado. We were certain we had the right men. All the evidence pointed to them. We didn't wait for a trial, didn't verify, just acted. Were they guilty? No. The word came out flat, dead. The real culprits turned up 2 weeks later, confessed to everything. By then, we'd already buried the 3 men we hanged. Iris drew in a sharp breath. So yes, Colt continued, I know what happens. I know how it feels to be certain and be wrong. I know what it does to you, carrying that weight. He met her eyes. That's why I left Colorado, why I keep moving. Because I can't outrun what I did, but I can at least try not to be there when others make the same mistake. And yet here you are. Here I am, he agreed, though I'm not sure what difference one more voice will make. Maybe none, Iris admitted, but maybe enough to give doubt room to breathe, to slow things down long enough for verification. She placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to save anyone, Mr. Rayner. Just help them save themselves. Colt didn't sleep that night. He lay on the narrow bed in his rented room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the town settle into an uneasy quiet. Occasionally, he heard voices in the street, men discussing the prisoners, making plans, feeding each other certainty. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and gold, Colt made his decision. He couldn't stop what was coming, but maybe, just maybe, he could slow it down long enough for truth to catch up to vengeance. And if he couldn't, if history repeated itself despite his efforts, well, at least this time he'd be on the right side of it. At least this time, he'd try. The first light of morning found Colt standing outside the stone building that held the prisoners. The street was empty save for a single guard, a lean man in his 30s who sat on a barrel with a rifle across his knees, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The guard's eyes tracked Colt's approach with the wariness of a man who'd been told to trust no strangers. Building's closed. Wasn't planning on going in. Colt stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible and empty. Just wondering if they've been fed. That's none of your concern. Maybe not, but I'm asking anyway. The guard shifted his weight, the rifle moving slightly. Who are you? Name's Colt Rayner. Rode in yesterday afternoon, got a room at Mrs. Harmon's boarding house. He nodded toward the stone building. Those men in there? They've been given water at least? What's it to you? Nothing, I suppose. Except that even guilty men deserve water. And if they're innocent, well, treating them poorly only adds to the injustice. The guard's expression flickered with something, doubt, perhaps, or discomfort. They got water an hour ago. Mrs. Patterson brought it, along with some bread. That's good. That's decent. Colt pulled out his tobacco pouch and papers. Mind if I roll one? Free country. Colt took his time with the cigarette, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The guard watched him but seemed to relax slightly as the silence stretched. Finally, Colt said, You believe they did it? Killed Dalton? The guard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried less certainty than his posture suggested. Don't know what I believe, only know that Martin and the others are convinced, and they're the ones who knew Dalton. Being convinced and being right aren't always the same thing. Maybe not. The guard spat into the dirt. But we got to do something. Can't just let men murder our own and walk away. Agreed. But hanging the wrong men doesn't bring Dalton back. Just adds more bodies to the count. Colt lit the cigarette, the smoke curling up into the morning air. What's your name? Frank Hewitt. You from around here, Frank? Born in Missouri, came west 5 years ago. Got a claim up the valley, panning for color when there's water enough. Frank's shoulders sagged slightly. Look, I don't like this any more than you seem to, but Dalton was a good man. His wife and kids are suffering. If those three in there did this thing, then justice needs serving. And if they didn't? Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question hung between them like smoke. The street began to wake. Doors open, smoke rose from chimneys. The sounds of a town stirring to life filled the air. Women headed toward the creek with laundry baskets. A wagon rattled past, the driver nodding to Frank but eyeing Colt with suspicion. The blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic song against the anvil. Normal sounds. Normal activities. As if three men weren't locked in a root cellar awaiting a fate that seemed increasingly predetermined. Iris Harmon appeared from the direction of her boarding house, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She stopped when she saw Colt, a brief smile crossing her face before settling into determined neutrality. "Morning, Frank," she said to the guard. "Brought breakfast for the prisoners." Frank stood, uncertain. "I don't know if Martin said, 'Martin isn't here, and those men need to eat.'" Iris's tone brooked no argument. "You going to stop me from showing basic Christian charity?" "No, ma'am, I reckon not." Frank produced a key and unlocked the heavy door. "But I'm going in with you." "Fair enough." Colt followed without asking permission. Frank shot him a look but didn't object. They descended rough stone steps into a cellar that smelled of earth and old vegetables and human fear. The three prisoners sat against the far wall, their hands still bound. They looked up at the visitors with expressions that ranged from hope to resignation. Elias Boone spoke first. "Mrs. Harmon, isn't it? I heard them use your name last night." "It is." Iris knelt and began unpacking her basket. Bread, cheese, apples, a jar of water. "I run the boarding house. Thought you could use something more substantial than what you've been given." "You're very kind." Elias's voice carried genuine gratitude, more than we have any right to expect under the circumstances. "Every man has a right to food and water." Iris began cutting the bread with a knife she'd brought. "That's not kindness. That's basic decency." The young one, Toby, spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "Are they going to hang us?" The question landed like a stone into still water. Frank shifted uncomfortably. Iris's hands paused in their work before resuming with deliberate care. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm working to make sure proper procedure is followed. The territorial marshal has been sent for. He should arrive within 3 days. 3 days is a long time when men are afraid and angry," Elias said quietly. He looked at Colt. "You're the stranger I saw arrive yesterday, the one who rode in alone." "Colt Rayner." "Elias Boone. This is Toby Hale, and—" He gestured to the third man, who'd remained silent. "Our companion prefers not to share his name with strangers. No offense intended." "None taken." Colt studied the three men carefully. Elias appeared exactly as the stable boy had described. Educated, measured, somewhere in his 50s with a beard going gray and intelligent eyes that held more resignation than fear. Toby looked younger than his 19 years, soft-faced and terrified despite obvious efforts to hide it. The third man was harder to read, perhaps 40, with features that suggested origins somewhere in Eastern Europe or Russia, watching everything with the alertness of a hunted animal who'd survived by staying vigilant. "You're a carpenter, you said?" Colt asked Elias. "Among other things. I've worked with my hands most of my life, building, repairing, creating things that last." Elias held up his scarred left hand. "This came from carelessness with a ripsaw 3 weeks ago, in case you were wondering. Bled like the devil, but healed clean enough." "The description they're working from—" "I know. Dark beard, scar on the left hand. Half the working men in the territories could match it." Elias's tone remained even, but underneath it ran a current of frustration. "We told them where we were 2 nights ago. Told them about the homesteader we spoke with, Henderson at Widow's Creek. Has anyone bothered to verify that?" Frank cleared his throat. "Martin sent 2 men to check first thing this morning. Should have word by afternoon." "And if Henderson confirms our story?" Then I expect you'll be released with apologies. Frank didn't sound entirely convinced. And if Henderson's not home or doesn't remember, or Martin's men don't believe him? Elias leaned forward slightly. What then? Does absence of confirmation become proof of guilt? No one answered. The question sat heavy in the damp cellar air. Iris finished distributing the food and stood. I should go, but I'll be back this afternoon with supper. Thank you, Elias said. Truly, it's been my experience that in dark times, small kindnesses matter more than grand gestures. As they climbed back up to street level, Colt heard Toby speaking softly to Elias. We're going to die here, aren't we? Elias's response was too quiet to make out, but the tone carried something that might have been comfort or might have been shared despair. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. More people moved through the street now, and Colt noticed they fell into two distinct groups. The larger group, perhaps 2/3 of those visible, moved with purpose and certainty, their faces hard when they glanced toward the stone building. But the smaller group moved differently, with sideways looks and hushed conversations, and the body language of people who disagreed but didn't quite dare speak up. A man emerged from one of the smaller houses and walked directly toward them. He was perhaps 35, with the lean build of someone who worked with his mind more than his body. He wore spectacles that caught the morning light, and carried himself with the particular blend of confidence and nervousness that marked school teachers everywhere. Mrs. Harmon, he said, nodding respectfully. Then to Colt, Samuel Reed. I teach at the schoolhouse when we have enough students to warrant it. Colt Rayner. I saw you arrive yesterday. Iris told me you might be sympathetic to cooler heads. Samuel glanced around, lowering his voice. I'm trying to organize a meeting tonight. People who think we should wait for the marshal, follow proper legal channels. Would you attend? What good would a meeting do? Strength in numbers, perhaps. Right now, everyone who doubts is isolated, afraid to speak up alone. If we stand together, show Martin and the others that a significant portion of this town wants due process. Samuel trailed off, his expression suggesting he heard the weakness in his own argument. How many people are you expecting? Colt asked. Hard to say. I've spoken to perhaps a dozen who are willing. Maybe more will come if they know they're not alone. And Martin? Does he know you're organizing opposition? Not opposition, just advocacy for patience and procedure. Samuel removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his shirt, a nervous gesture. But yes, he knows. He's not pleased, but he hasn't tried to stop me. Yet. Oh, Frank, who'd been listening silently, spoke up. Sam, you're playing a dangerous game. Martin's got most of the town behind him. You push too hard, you'll just isolate yourself. Then I'll be isolated, Samuel said with quiet firmness. I won't be part of a lynching, Frank. I won't let this town become the kind of place where we hang men based on convenience and grief. No one's talking about lynching, aren't they? Samuel's voice sharpened. What exactly do you think happens if Henderson doesn't confirm their story? Or if he does, but Martin decides it's not enough? We don't have a jail, Frank. We don't have a judge. We've got a root cellar and a lot of angry men and 3 strangers nobody will miss. How do you think this ends? Frank's silence was answer enough. The meeting Samuel had organized took place that evening in the back room of his small house at the edge of town. Colt arrived as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. He'd spent the afternoon observing, listening, taking the temperature of Sweetwater's collective mood. What he'd learned wasn't encouraging. The 2 men Martin had sent to verify Elias's story had returned around midday. They'd found Henderson's homestead, but the old man hadn't been home. His place showed signs of recent occupation. Warm ashes in the fireplace, tools left out as if he'd stepped away briefly, but Henderson himself was nowhere to be found. The news had spread through town like spilled oil, and everyone interpreted it through the lens of their existing beliefs. Those convinced of the prisoner's guilt saw it as suspicious. Perhaps Henderson had been paid off or threatened. Those harboring doubt saw it as meaningless. Henderson was a trapper who spent days at a time in the backcountry. But doubt was losing ground to certainty. Colt could feel it in the way people talked, the way they looked at the stone building, the way Sarah Dalton's grief seemed to give permission for everyone else's anger. Samuel's house was modest. 2 rooms, simply furnished, with more books than any other possession. When Colt entered, he found about 15 people already gathered. Most were men, but a few women had come as well. Iris Harmon was there, along with Frank Hewitt, surprisingly. The others Colt didn't recognize: townspeople, ranchers, the kinds of faces that blurred together in frontier settlements. Samuel stood at the front of the room, looking both determined and terrified. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know it took courage, especially given the current mood." "Get to the point, Sam," one of the men said. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That we advocate as a group for waiting, for due process, for verification before action." Samuel gestured to the gathered group. "We represent a significant portion of this town. If we speak together, Martin will have to listen." "Martin's already made up his mind," a woman said. She was perhaps 40, with work-worn hands and eyes that suggested she'd seen her share of frontier hardship. "I know his type. He's decided those men are guilty, and nothing will shake that loose." "Then we speak to the others," Samuel insisted. "Not everyone is as certain as Martin. If we can create enough doubt, enough calls for caution—" "You'll just make yourself a target," Frank interrupted. "Sam, I admire what you're trying to do, but you need to understand the reality. Dalton was respected. His murder scared people. Scared people want quick answers and visible justice. You get in the way of that, they'll turn on you too." "So we do nothing?" Samuel's voice rose with frustration. "We just stand by and watch while potentially innocent men are hanged?" "We don't know they're innocent," another man pointed out. "Could be they did exactly what Martin says." "Could be," Colt spoke for the first time, drawing everyone's attention. "But could be isn't good enough for a hanging. You need certainty. You need proof. Right now, all you've got is timing and a description that fits half the territory." "And who are you to tell us what we need?" The question came from a thick-set man near the back. "You just rode in. This isn't your town, isn't your problem." "You're right on both counts," Colt agreed. "But I've been where you are. I've been part of a posse convinced they had the right men. We were wrong, and I've spent 5 years trying to live with what we did." The room went very quiet. Colt continued, "3 men died because we were certain, because we couldn't wait, because grief and fear convinced us that speed mattered more than truth. 2 weeks later, the real killers confessed. Too late to matter, too late to undo." "That's a terrible story," the thick-set man said, "but it doesn't change our situation." "Doesn't it? You've got 3 strangers in a root cellar, a description from a dying man, and an alibi you haven't been able to verify yet. That's not certainty. That's coincidence. Maybe it's damning coincidence. Maybe it's just bad luck. But you won't know which unless you wait for proper investigation." Iris spoke up. "The marshal will be here in 3 days. Surely we can maintain control for 3 days." "Can we?" Frank looked around the room. "Be honest. How many of you would bet your lives that Martin and the others will wait that long? Especially if something happens to tip the scales. Another rumor, another piece of circumstantial evidence, Sarah Dalton making another appeal." "Then we make it impossible for them to act," Samuel said. "We organize watches, make sure those men are never left unguarded except by people committed to their safety." "You're talking about standing against your neighbors," the woman with work-worn hands said quietly. "Maybe against your friends. Are you prepared for that? For what comes after, regardless of how this ends?" The question hung in the air. Colt watched the faces around the room and saw the calculation happening, the weighing of conscience against consequence, of principles against pragmatism. It was a weight he knew well. "I am," Samuel said finally. "I'd rather face my neighbor's anger than face myself, knowing I stood by and did nothing." "Easy words when you're unmarried with no children," someone muttered. "Actually, it makes it harder," Samuel shot back. "If I had family, I could tell myself I was protecting them by staying quiet. I don't have that excuse. All I have is the choice between right and wrong, and I choose right." Slowly, reluctantly, about half the people in the room nodded. The other half looked less certain, and Colt knew that when push came to shove, uncertainty would default to the path of least resistance. They talked for another hour, making plans that felt increasingly hollow even as they articulated them. Shifts would be organized to keep watch over the prisoners. Samuel would continue trying to sway undecided townspeople. Someone would ride out again at first light to find Henderson and get confirmation of the alibi. But underneath the planning, Colt heard what wasn't being said, that they were organizing a defense against something that might be unstoppable, that good intentions and logical arguments might not matter when fear had the momentum. The meeting broke up as full dark settled over the valley. People left in ones and twos, not wanting to be seen departing as a group. Colt hung back, and when most had gone, he found himself alone with Samuel and Iris. "Thank you for speaking," Samuel said. "Your story had impact. I could see it in their faces." "Impact doesn't mean change," Colt replied. "You're fighting against fear, Sam. Fear is a powerful motivator. So is conscience. Sometimes, when it's convenient, when it doesn't cost too much." Colt moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street. Lantern light showed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Everything looked peaceful, normal. But when conscience and self-preservation collide, most people choose survival. "You're awfully cynical for someone who came to a meeting advocating for the right thing," Iris observed. "Cynical and realistic aren't the same thing. I want you to succeed, Sam. I want those men to get a fair shake, a proper trial, actual justice. But wanting it doesn't make it likely." Colt turned to face them. "What's your backup plan if Martin decides to act before the marshal arrives?" Samuel's expression showed he hadn't considered it. We'd intervene. Physically, if necessary. 15 people against 30 or 40? Armed and angry and convinced they're in the right? Colt shook his head. "That's not intervention. That's suicide." "Then what do you suggest?" Colt was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I suggest you be ready to witness, to remember, to testify later about what happened, so even if you can't stop it, at least there's a record. At least someone will know the truth." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but they were the closest thing to honesty he could offer. Because he'd learned in Colorado that sometimes you couldn't save people. Sometimes all you could do was remember them accurately and carry the weight of that failure forward. The next day dawned cold and gray, with clouds pressing low over the valley like a lid on a pot. Colt woke early and made his way to the stone building. A different guard sat watch, an older man named Pete, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Harmon already brought breakfast," Pete said before Colt could ask. "I'm not here for that. Just wanted to check on them." Pete studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Your funeral if Martin catches you being too sympathetic." The prisoners looked worse than they had the previous morning. The damp cellar and the weight of uncertainty were taking their toll. Toby had developed a cough. The foreign man sat perfectly still, like an animal conserving energy for a fight it knew was coming. Elias looked tired but alert, his eyes tracking Colt's descent with sharp attention. "Mr. Rayner," Elias said. "Come to offer comfort or gather information?" "Neither, just checking in." "Forgive me if I find that hard to believe. You've been watching us since we were brought in. Watching the town, trying to figure something out." Elias shifted position, his bound hands making the movement awkward. "What is it you're trying to decide?" Colt sat on the bottom step. "Whether you're guilty." And I think you're probably not, but probably isn't good enough when men's lives hang in the balance." "No," Elias agreed. "It isn't. So what will you do with your probably? Will you act on it or simply file it away as an interesting observation? What would you have me do? Help us escape?" The words hung in the cellar's close air. Toby's eyes widened. The foreign man's attention sharpened visibly. Colt kept his expression neutral. "That would make you look guilty," he pointed out. "We look guilty now. At least if we run, we have a chance." Elias leaned forward. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Rayner. I can read a town's temperature as well as anyone. They're going to hang us. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Before the marshal arrives, before verification can happen, before inconvenient facts can intrude on their certainty." "You don't know that." "Don't I? I've seen Sarah Dalton's eyes. I've heard the men talking when they think we can't hear. I know how this plays out." Elias's voice remained calm, but underneath ran a current of desperation carefully controlled. "We're innocent, but that doesn't matter anymore. We're convenient. We're here. We're strangers no one will mourn. That's enough. If I help you escape and you're guilty, we're not. If you are," Colt continued, "I'll have aided murderers. I'll have helped the men who killed Jacob Dalton and orphaned his children. And if you don't help us and we're innocent, you'll have stood by while innocent men were hanged. Which guilt would you rather carry?" Colt stood abruptly. "I'll think about it." "Don't think too long," Elias said quietly. "Time's running out faster than you realize." Outside, Colt found Frank Hewitt waiting. The younger man looked agitated, his rifle held tighter than necessary. "You need to hear this," Frank said without preamble. "Something's happened." They walked toward the center of town, where a crowd had gathered near the Lucky Dollar Saloon. Martin stood on the porch, and even from a distance, Colt could see the change in him, the hardening of certainty into something sharper and more dangerous. "Found this morning, not 5 miles from where we picked them up," Martin was saying, holding up a piece of cloth. Even from where Colt stood, he could see it was torn and stained dark with what looked like blood. One of Dalton's men wore a shirt this color, blue check pattern, exactly like this. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah Dalton stood near the front. Her children clustered around her, and her face held an expression that made Colt's stomach drop. "Where exactly did you find it?" Samuel Reed's voice cut through the murmuring. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale but determined. "Miller's Canyon, hidden under some rocks near the creek. One of the men searching the area came across it this morning." "Convenient," Samuel said, and the word fell like a stone into water. Martin's eyes found him. "You calling me a liar, Sam?" "I'm saying it's awfully convenient that a piece of evidence turns up now, just when doubt was starting to spread." Samuel's voice shook slightly, but he held his ground. "And I'm wondering who found it, and whether anyone else can verify. Are you suggesting I planted evidence?" Martin's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "I'm suggesting that confirmation bias is real, and that frightened people sometimes see what they want to see." The crowd's mood shifted palpably. People who'd been listening with interest now looked at Samuel with something closer to hostility. Colt saw it happening and knew Samuel had made a crucial mistake, not in what he'd said, but in how and when. Martin descended from the porch, moving toward Samuel with deliberate steps. "My friend was murdered. His family is suffering. And you're standing here suggesting I'd manufacture evidence?" "I'm suggesting we need to be careful. Careful." Martin's voice dripped contempt. "We've been careful, Sam. We've waited. We've tried to verify their story, and what have we found? Nothing. Henderson's not home. Convenient for them. They just happened to be in the area at exactly the right time. They matched the description. And now we have physical evidence linking them to the crime." That piece of cloth could have come from anywhere, been planted by anyone. Or it could be exactly what it looks like, proof that those men killed Jacob Dalton and tried to hide the evidence. Martin turned to address the crowd. "How much more do we need? How many pieces have to fall into place before we stop making excuses and start demanding justice?" The crowd's response was immediate and visceral. People shouted agreement, nodded vigorously, turned hostile eyes toward Samuel and the few others who'd been advocating caution. Colt felt the moment slip away like water through cupped hands. This was the tipping point he'd sensed coming, the moment when doubt crystallized into certainty and fear found its justification. "We should take a vote," Martin continued. "Those in favor of holding a trial right now, today, with the whole town serving as judge and jury, say aye." The ayes rose like the wave, drowning out the handful of voices that tried to object. Martin smiled, but there was no joy in it, only grim satisfaction. "Then it's decided. We'll convene at sundown in front of the stone building. We'll hear from the accused, consider the evidence, and render a verdict." He paused. "And if that verdict is guilty, we'll carry out sentence immediately. Justice delayed is justice denied, and we've delayed long enough." The crowd began to disperse, energy and purpose evident in their movements. Samuel stood alone, looking shell-shocked, and when Colt caught his eye, he saw the realization there. They'd lost. Iris Harmon appeared at Colt's elbow. "This is wrong," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "This is exactly what we were trying to prevent." "I know. So what do we do?" Colt watched Martin accepting congratulations from various townspeople, saw Sarah Dalton speaking quietly with her children, noticed the way people carefully avoided looking at Samuel or the handful of others who'd advocated for patience. "We watch," he said finally. "We bear witness. And we try to make sure that if this goes the way I think it will, at least there's someone left who knows the truth. That's not enough." "No," Colt agreed. "It's not. But it might be all we've got." The afternoon crawled toward evening with the inexorable weight of fate. Colt spent the hours moving through Sweetwater like a ghost, watching the town prepare for what it was calling justice, but what felt increasingly like ritual sacrifice. Men gathered in small groups, their voices low and serious, reinforcing each other's certainty with every exchanged word. Women whispered on porches, some with satisfaction, others with barely concealed unease. Children sensed the tension and played quieter than usual, their games subdued by the adult anxiety that hung over everything like storm clouds. Samuel Reed tried one last time to rally opposition. Colt watched him move from house to house, knocking on doors, making his case with increasing desperation. Most people listened politely and closed their doors with finality. A few were more direct in their rejection, telling Samuel outright that he was on the wrong side of this, that his education had made him soft, that book learning didn't compare to the hard wisdom of frontier survival. By 4 in the afternoon, Samuel had given up. Colt found him sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse, his head in his hands, looking like a man who'd run a race and lost badly. "I failed," Samuel said without looking up. "I thought reason would matter. I thought if people just heard the arguments clearly, they'd see the danger in rushing to judgment." "Reason matters," Colt said, sitting beside him. "Just not as much as fear. And right now, fear's winning. Those men are going to die tonight. Innocent men." Samuel finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "And I couldn't stop it. All my words, all my principles, all my certainty that right would prevail, none of it mattered." "It mattered to you. That counts for something." "Does it?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. "What good is personal integrity when 3 men hang because I couldn't persuade my neighbors? What's the value of a clean conscience when it comes at the price of innocent blood?" Colt didn't have an answer. He'd asked himself the same questions for 5 years, and the only truth he'd found was that sometimes you carried weights that couldn't be put down, guilt that couldn't be absolved, knowledge that couldn't be forgotten. "There's still time," Samuel said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. The marshal could arrive early. Henderson could show up with confirmation. Someone could— "No," Colt interrupted gently. "It's over, Sam. The town's made its decision. All that's left now is the performance." "Then we stop the performance. We free them, help them escape, and become fugitives ourselves. Make ourselves targets of the same mob justice?" Colt shook his head. "I thought about it. Spent half the night working through scenarios. There's no version of that plan that doesn't end with more people dead." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "What kind of people are we, that we let this happen? What does it say about us that fear trumps everything we claim to believe in? It says we're human, flawed and frightened and capable of terrible things when we convince ourselves those things are necessary." Colt stood, brushing dust from his pants. "The question isn't what kind of people we are right now. It's what kind of people we'll be after, when we have to live with what we've done." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the town gathered in front of the stone building. Someone had erected a makeshift platform using barrels and planks, creating a raised area where Martin and several other town leaders stood. Lanterns were lit against the coming darkness, casting harsh shadows across faces that ranged from grimly satisfied to deeply troubled. Colt positioned himself at the edge of the crowd where he could see everything but wouldn't be noticed. Iris Harmon stood nearby with several other women, her face pale but composed. Frank Hewitt was there too, his rifle held loosely, looking like a man fulfilling a duty he'd rather abandon. Samuel had come as well, standing apart from the main crowd, isolated by his opposition. Sarah Dalton arrived with her children just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The crowd parted for her, and she took a position near the front where everyone could see her widow's black and the orphaned faces of her children. It was theater, Colt realized, deliberate staging designed to justify what came next. The visual reminder of loss, of grief, of why this mattered. Martin raised his hands for silence. The crowd settled quickly, anticipation evident in their posture. "We're gathered here tonight to render judgment," Martin began, his voice carrying across the crowd. 3 days ago, one of our own was murdered. Jacob Dalton was a good man, a family man, a pillar of this community. He was taken from us by cowards who struck in darkness and fled like the criminals they are. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Martin waited for it to subside before continuing. We've captured 3 men who were in the area at the time of the murder. They matched the description given by Jackson before he died. They have no verifiable alibi, no good reason for being in this valley, and today we found physical evidence linking them to the crime. He held up the torn, blood-stained cloth. This belonged to one of Jacob's men. We found it hidden near where these 3 were camped. The murmur grew louder, angrier. Colt watched faces transform as certainty hardened into righteousness. This was the moment of collective decision, when individual doubt dissolved into group conviction. "Bring them out," Martin commanded. The heavy door of the stone building opened and the 3 prisoners were led out. Their hands were still bound and they moved with the stiff awkwardness of men who'd spent days in confinement. In the lantern light, they looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than they had in the cellar's shadows. They were positioned on the platform facing the crowd. Elias stood in the center, his bearing still dignified despite the circumstances. Toby trembled visibly, his youth and terror impossible to hide. The foreign man remained impassive, but his eyes scanned the crowd with the calculating assessment of someone looking for escape routes and finding none. Martin addressed them directly. "You've been accused of murder and cattle theft. Before this assembly passes judgment, you have the right to speak in your own defense. What say you?" Elias stepped forward as much as his bonds allowed. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying across the gathered townspeople with the educated diction that had marked him from the start. "We are innocent," he said simply. "We had nothing to do with Mr. Dalton's death or the theft of his cattle. We are travelers passing through your valley, nothing more. The timing of our presence is unfortunate coincidence, not evidence of guilt. The description you're working from is vague enough to fit hundreds of men. And as for the cloth you claim links us to the crime, we have no knowledge of it, no explanation for how it came to be where you say you found it." "So you deny everything," Martin said. "I deny participation in a crime we didn't commit. I cannot deny being here, being strangers, having the misfortune of matching a dying man's unclear recollection." Elias's eyes swept the crowd. "But none of that constitutes proof. None of it justifies what you're about to do." "And what is it you think we're about to do?" "Hang us." The words fell like stones. Despite the absence of real evidence, despite not waiting for proper legal proceedings, despite the very real possibility that you're executing innocent men to satisfy your need for closure. The crowd erupted in shouts of denial and anger. Martin let it build for a moment before calling for silence. "You speak well," Martin acknowledged. "But words don't change facts. You were here. You match the description. You have no alibi we can verify. And now we have physical evidence. That's not coincidence. That's guilt." "That's expedience," Elias shot back. "You need someone to blame, and we're convenient. That's not the same as justice." "Tell me about Henderson," Martin demanded. "The homesteader you claim can verify your whereabouts. Why hasn't he come forward? Why can't we find him?" "I don't know. Perhaps he's hunting or trapping. Perhaps he's visiting family. Perhaps he simply doesn't know you're looking for him." Elias's composure was beginning to crack, desperation bleeding through. "But his absence doesn't prove our guilt any more than our presence proves it. It proves you lied. It proves nothing except that an old man isn't home when you want him to be." Martin turned to address the crowd. "I've heard enough. This man speaks pretty words, but they're empty. Lawyers' tricks designed to confuse the issue. But the issue is simple. Jacob Dalton is dead, and these men killed him." "You don't know that." The shout came from Samuel, who'd pushed forward through the crowd. "You're guessing, assuming, building a case on convenience rather than evidence. This isn't justice. It's revenge dressed up in legal theater." The crowd's attention shifted to Samuel, and the hostility was palpable. Someone shouted for him to shut up. Someone else called him a traitor to his own people. Martin's expression when he looked at Samuel held something close to pity. "Sam, you're a good man, an educated man, but you're wrong about this. Sometimes the simple truth is just that, simple. These men killed Jacob. They need to hang. That's justice, not revenge. Justice requires proof, not circumstance. It requires patience, not haste. It requires us to protect our own." Martin's voice rose to override Samuel's. "Jacob was one of us. He built this community alongside the rest of us. He raised his children here, worked his land here, died here. And you want us to let his killers go free because we can't meet some impossible standard of proof? You want us to wait for a marshal who might not arrive for days while the men responsible slip away? I want you to be certain before you commit murder. The word hung in the air like an accusation. The crowd went silent, and Colt saw the shift happen. Samuel had gone too far, crossed some invisible line from dissent into something the town could perceive as betrayal. Martin's voice, when he spoke, was cold. Murder is what happened to Jacob Dalton. What we're doing here is justice. If you can't see the difference, Sam, then maybe you've spent too much time with your books and not enough time in the real world. Someone in the crowd shouted agreement. Others joined in. The noise built until it was less individual voices than a collective roar of approval and righteousness. Martin raised his hands again, waiting for quiet. We'll put it to a vote, as is proper. All those who believe these men are guilty of Jacob Dalton's murder, raise your hands. Hands shot up across the crowd. Colt counted quickly. At least 3/4 of those assembled, maybe more. The lantern light caught on raised arms, creating a forest of shadows and certainty. And those who believe them innocent? Perhaps 10 hands rose, Samuel's among them. Iris Harmon's hand went up after a moment's hesitation. A few others scattered throughout the crowd, but they were overwhelmed by the majority, their dissent swallowed by collective conviction. The people have spoken, Martin declared. The verdict is guilty. Toby made a sound between a sob and a scream. The foreign man's face showed no emotion, but his body tensed like a wire about to snap. Elias simply closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they held the terrible resignation of a man who'd known this was coming, but had hoped against hope he was wrong. You're making a mistake, Elias said quietly. A terrible mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your lives. The only mistake would be letting you go unpunished, Martin replied. He gestured to several men who'd positioned themselves near the platform. Prepare the ropes. The crowd pressed closer, some with eager anticipation, others with the horrified fascination of people watching something terrible they couldn't stop. 3 ropes were produced, already fashioned into nooses. Someone had prepared them in advance, Colt realized. This outcome had been predetermined despite the theater of voting. A large cottonwood tree stood near the edge of the gathering area, its branches thick and strong. The ropes were thrown over a sturdy limb, the nooses dangling at roughly head height. The prisoners were led toward the tree, their bound hands making them stumble occasionally on the uneven ground. Wait. Elias's voice cut through the proceedings. Please, just wait one moment. Martin paused, perhaps surprised by the request. What is it? I have a letter. Elias turned awkwardly, trying to indicate his coat pocket with his bound hands. In my inside pocket. It's addressed to my sister in Philadelphia. I'd like someone to mail it, to let her know what became of me. That's a delay tactic, someone shouted. It's a dying man's last request, Elias interrupted. Surely even in your haste for vengeance, you can grant me that basic dignity. Martin considered for a moment, then nodded to one of the guards. Get the letter. The guard searched Elias's coat and produced a sealed envelope, yellowed and worn from travel. He handed it to Martin, who examined it in the lantern light. It's just a letter, the guard confirmed. Sealed, addressed like he said. Then it will be mailed, Martin said, tucking it into his own pocket. Your sister will know what happened here tonight, that you died paying for your crimes. She'll know that you murdered an innocent man, Elias corrected quietly. And that knowledge will haunt this town long after we're gone. The words landed like prophecy, and Colt saw several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. But the momentum was too strong to be stopped by discomfort or doubt. The machine of collective justice, once set in motion, ground forward with terrible inevitability. The 3 men were positioned beneath the nooses. Colt watched from his vantage point, marking every detail with the grim necessity of witness. He would remember this, he promised himself, would carry it forward as he'd carried Colorado, would ensure that even if he couldn't stop it, at least someone knew the truth. Chairs were brought and placed beneath each man. They were made to stand on them, and the nooses were fitted around their necks with practiced efficiency that suggested someone in the crowd had done this before. The rough hemp was adjusted, tightened, positioned with careful precision. Toby was crying now, making no effort to hide his terror. Please, he kept saying, please, we didn't do anything. Please don't do this. The foreign man spoke for the first time. Words in a language Colt didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. pleas, prayers, perhaps curses on those about to kill him. His voice rose and fell in rhythms that sounded ancient, primal, the sound of humanity facing extinction and refusing to go quietly. Elias remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the valley, perhaps beyond this world entirely. His face held an expression of profound sorrow, not for himself, Colt thought, but for the people about to become his executioners. Martin stepped forward one final time. "Do any of you have final words?" "Yes." Elias's voice was steady despite the rope around his neck. "I forgive you, all of you. You're frightened and hurting, and fear makes people do terrible things. I understand that, but understanding doesn't change what you're doing. You're about to murder 3 innocent men. And when the truth comes out, and it will, eventually, you'll have to live with that knowledge. I don't envy you that burden." "Save your philosophy for the afterlife," someone in the crowd shouted. Elias ignored the interruption, his attention focused on Martin. There's still time to stop this, to wait for the marshal, to investigate properly, to do this right. The moment you kick these chairs away, that opportunity is gone forever. Choose carefully, Mr. Martin, because this choice will define you for the rest of your life. For just a moment, Colt saw doubt flicker across Martin's face. The mask of certainty slipped, revealing something more human and conflicted underneath. But then Sarah Dalton stepped forward from the crowd, her children behind her, and the sight of her seemed to steel his resolve. "My husband didn't get a choice," Martin said. "He didn't get time or mercy or consideration. He got a bullet in the dark and a shallow grave. That's what you gave him. Now you'll get what you deserve." He nodded to the men standing by the chairs. "No!" Samuel lurched forward from the crowd, trying to reach the platform. "Stop! This is wrong! You can't!" 2 men grabbed him, holding him back. Samuel struggled against them, his voice rising in desperate protest. "You're making a mistake. They're innocent. Please, for the love of everything decent." "Remove him," Martin ordered coldly. Samuel was dragged away, still shouting, his voice growing hoarse with desperation and horror. The crowd watched his removal with varying expressions, some satisfied, others uncomfortable, a few quietly approving of his courage even as they did nothing to support it. Colt's hands clenched at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to do something, anything to stop what was happening, but he forced himself to remain still, to watch, to bear witness. This was his penance for Colorado. Not to intervene and fail again, but to see clearly and remember accurately. Martin raised his hand, holding it high where everyone could see. The crowd fell silent, the only sounds the muffled sobs of Toby Hale and the foreign man's continued murmuring in his unknown tongue. "For the murder of Jacob Dalton and theft of his cattle," Martin proclaimed, "the sentence is death by hanging. May it serve as justice for the wronged and warning for the wicked." His hand fell. The men kicked the chairs away. The 3 bodies dropped simultaneously, the ropes snapping taut with sounds that would haunt Colt's dreams for years to come. Toby's legs kicked frantically, fighting the inevitable. The foreign man's body convulsed once, twice, then went still with the terrible finality of ended life. Elias hung without struggle, his eyes open and staring at the stars emerging in the darkening sky above. The crowd watched in silence. No one cheered, no one celebrated. They simply stood there, bearing witness to what they'd done, as the 3 bodies swayed gently in the evening breeze. It took longer than people expected. Hanging, Colt knew from bitter experience, was rarely quick unless the drop was calculated perfectly. These men had been given short drops from chairs, meaning they'd strangled rather than dying instantly from broken necks. It was cruel, even if unintentionally so, and the prolonged nature of their dying seemed to drain whatever satisfaction the crowd had anticipated. Toby was the last to stop moving, his young body fighting death with the desperation of youth. When he finally went still, a collective exhalation passed through the crowd. Relief, perhaps, that the difficult part was over. Martin stepped forward and checked each body, feeling for pulses at their necks despite the obvious. After a moment, he turned to face the town. "It's done," he said simply. "Justice is served." But his voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction. He sounded tired and old, and when Colt looked closely, he could see the beginning of doubt creeping into Martin's eyes, the first hairline cracks in the edifice of certainty. The crowd began to disperse slowly. people moving away in quiet groups rather than the animated clusters that had gathered earlier. The energy had drained out of the evening, leaving behind something hollow and unsettling. Even those who'd been most vocal in demanding the execution seemed subdued now, as if the reality of what they'd done was settling onto their shoulders like a physical weight. Iris Harmon stood frozen, her face pale in the lantern light, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Frank Hewitt had turned away, unable or unwilling to look at the hanged men. Others exhibited varying degrees of discomfort, satisfaction, or careful neutrality. Colt forced himself to keep looking at the three bodies swaying in the gentle wind. He memorized their faces in death, added them to the gallery of ghosts he already carried. Elias Boone, with his educated bearing and calm acceptance. Toby Hale, who'd been too young to die like this. The unnamed foreign man who'd faced his end speaking words none of them understood. Someone would need to cut them down, prepare them for burial. Someone would need to go through their belongings, try to contact whatever family might exist somewhere beyond this valley. Someone would need to remember their names and the circumstances of their deaths. Colt knew with grim certainty that he would be part of that someone, whether he wanted to be or not. The night deepened around Sweetwater, stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky. The valley that had seemed merely harsh that first afternoon now felt actively malevolent, a place where fear had been allowed to metastasize into action, where collective certainty had overwhelmed individual doubt. Martin stood alone on the platform after everyone else had left, staring at the three bodies. The letter Elias had requested be mailed was still in his pocket, forgotten in the rush to completion. Colt watched him from the shadows and saw the moment when reality truly hit, when the righteousness drained away and left only the irreversible fact of what had been done. 3 men hung from a cottonwood tree in a frontier valley. 3 men who might have been guilty or might have been innocent, but who would never get the chance to prove either way. 3 men whose deaths had been decided by circumstance and fear and the terrible human need to make sense of tragedy by assigning blame. Somewhere to the north, the real killers, if these men had truly been innocent, were probably already across the border into Canada, their crime unpunished, their presence unknown. Somewhere to the south, a homesteader named Henderson went about his business, unaware that his absence had sealed 3 men's fates. Somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman would eventually receive her brother's last letter and learn that he died protesting his innocence to the end. And here in Sweetwater, a town would have to live with what it had chosen to do. Colt turned away from the scene and walked back toward the boarding house. Behind him, the 3 bodies continued their gentle sway, casting long shadows in the lantern light that seemed to reach across the entire valley like accusing fingers. The night was far from over, but the worst of it, Colt believed, was done. The execution had been carried out, the verdict rendered, the town's need for justice satisfied. He was wrong. The worst was yet to come. Colt didn't make it back to the boarding house. He'd taken perhaps 20 steps when the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley, rapid and urgent, coming from the south road. He turned, along with several others who'd been making their way home, and watched as a rider thundered into town at a pace that spoke of desperation or emergency. The horse was lathered and heaving, pushed hard enough that Colt wondered if it would survive the night. The rider dismounted before the animal had fully stopped, stumbling slightly as his boots hit the ground. He was young, maybe 25, wearing the dust of hard travel and an expression that made Colt's stomach turn to ice. "Where's Martin?" the rider shouted, his voice cracking with exertion, and something else, urgency that bordered on panic. "I need to find Martin right now." People pointed toward the hanging tree, where Martin still stood in solitary contemplation. The rider ran toward him, and Colt found himself following along with a growing crowd of others who'd been drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Martin!" The rider reached him, doubled over for a moment to catch his breath. "Sir, I have news, urgent news from the Dalton Ranch." Martin turned slowly, his face still shadowed by whatever thoughts had occupied him. "What news? Has something else happened?" "No, sir. It's about what happened before. About Mr. Dalton." The rider straightened, and in the lantern light his face showed confusion and concern. "Sir, Jacob Dalton isn't dead." The words fell into the night like stones into still water, and the ripples spread outward in waves of shock and disbelief. Martin stared at the rider as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "What did you say?" "Jacob Dalton is alive, sir. wounded badly, but alive. He's been at the ranch this whole time, unconscious. The doctor from Silver Creek finally got him stable enough to talk today, and he sent me to tell you the men who attacked the ranch, they've been caught. 2 drifters named Cassidy and Monroe. They confessed everything. They're being held in Silver Creek awaiting the marshal. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Colt watched Martin's face cycle through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, before settling on something that looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. "That's impossible," Martin said, but his voice had no conviction. Jackson said, "Before he died, he said, Jackson didn't die either, sir. He's recovering alongside Mr. Dalton. He was delirious when he gave that description, apparently, mixed up what he saw with fever dreams. The doctor says it happens sometimes with head wounds." The writer glanced around at the growing crowd, seeming to notice for the first time the 3 bodies hanging from the cottonwood tree. His face went pale. "Sir, who are those men?" No one answered. The crowd had gone deathly still, every person processing what they'd just heard, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. Martin's eyes moved from the rider to the hanging bodies and back again. "Jacob's alive," he repeated, as if saying it might make it less real. "And you've caught the real attackers?" "Yes, sir. They had some of the stolen cattle with them when the Silver Creek sheriff found them camped about 30 miles west. They tried to run, but—" The rider's voice trailed off as he looked again at the hanged men. "Sir, those men there, did you think they were the ones who attacked the ranch?" Still no one spoke. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Colt felt something break loose inside his chest, not satisfaction at being proven right, but a familiar wave of sick horror that he'd hoped never to feel again. He looked at the crowd and saw his own reaction mirrored in face after face. The certainty that had carried them through the execution was crumbling, replaced by the awful understanding of what they'd done. Sarah Dalton pushed through the crowd, her children forgotten behind her. "My husband is alive?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Jacob's alive?" "Yes, ma'am. Hurt bad, but the doctor says he'll recover given time." Sarah's knees buckled. Someone caught her before she fell, but she twisted away from the supporting hands, her eyes fixed on the 3 bodies. "Then these men, She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The truth was written in the bodies swaying gently in the night breeze, in the faces of the townspeople, in the hollow triumph that had already turned to ash in everyone's mouths. "You hanged innocent men," Iris Harmon's voice cut through the silence. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her face wet with tears but her voice steady and cold as winter iron. "You were so certain, so absolutely sure, and you hanged 3 innocent men." "We didn't know," someone protested weakly. "How could we have known? You could have waited." Samuel Reed's voice came from where he'd been released and now stood among them, his face a mask of anguish and vindication that brought no joy. "You could have verified, investigated, exercised the smallest amount of patience, but you chose certainty over caution, vengeance over justice, and now 3 men are dead for no reason except your own fear." "Samuel, that's not fair," Martin began, but his voice cracked. "Fair?" Samuel's laugh was harsh and broken. "You want to talk about fair? Ask those 3 men about fair. Ask Elias Boone, who tried to tell you he was innocent. Ask Toby Hale, who was barely more than a boy. Ask the man whose name we never even learned because we were too busy killing him to care who he was." Martin turned away from Samuel, from the crowd, from everything, and walked toward the hanging tree. He stood beneath the bodies, looking up at Elias's face frozen in death, and whatever he saw there seemed to break something fundamental inside him. "I was so sure," he said, and his voice was the sound of a man watching himself from a great distance. All the evidence pointed to them, the timing, the description, the location. "That piece of cloth we found." "What piece of cloth?" Frank Hewitt stepped forward, his young face confused. "Martin, I was with the search party this morning. We didn't find any cloth." "Where did that come from?" Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out the blue-checked fabric he'd shown the crowd earlier. In the lamplight, Colt could see it clearly now. The way the edges were too clean, the blood too evenly distributed, the whole thing too convenient. "I found it," Martin said hollowly, after the others had moved on. "It was just lying there, exactly where it should have been if these men were guilty. Or exactly where someone would put it if they wanted to manufacture evidence, Samuel said quietly. Did you plant it, Martin? Tell us the truth. No. Martin's voice was barely audible. I found it. I swear I found it. But now I wonder if I found it because it was really there, or because I needed it to be there. If I saw what I wanted to see, because the alternative was admitting we had nothing solid, nothing real, just suspicions and fear. The confession landed like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd made sounds of protest or denial, but the words died quickly. Because they'd all done the same thing in their own ways. Seen what they wanted to see, believed what they needed to believe, constructed a case from circumstantial evidence and collective anxiety. Colt watched it all unfold with the detached observation of someone who'd lived this nightmare before. He'd known how this would end from the moment the posse rode out to Miller's Canyon, had felt it in his bones, in his memories, in the terrible familiarity of men convincing themselves that speed mattered more than accuracy. But knowing hadn't stopped it. Nothing had stopped it. We should cut them down, Iris said, her voice rough with grief. It's the least we can do. Give them a decent burial. Treat their bodies with the respect we denied them in life. Several men moved to comply, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and shame. They retrieved knives and began cutting the ropes, lowering the bodies with a gentleness that would have been appropriate hours earlier, but now felt like hollow ceremony. Elias's body was laid on the ground first, his eyes still open and staring at stars he could no longer see. Frank closed them with trembling fingers, then had to step away quickly before he was sick. Toby was next, looking even younger in death than he had in life, his face peaceful now that the terror had ended. The foreign man was last, and as they laid him beside the others, someone noticed a small leather pouch around his neck. Iris knelt and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small daguerreau-type photograph. The paper was covered in writing none of them could read, but the photograph showed a young woman holding an infant. He had a family, Iris said, her voice breaking. Somewhere out there, he has a wife and child waiting for him to come home. The reality of that struck the crowd like a hammer blow. These hadn't been nameless drifters, convenient scapegoats without connections or consequences. They'd been men with lives, with families, with futures that had been stolen based on nothing more substantial than timing and fear. Sarah Dalton made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with the force of her grief and guilt. Her children ran to her, clustering around her with the confused concern of young ones who understood something terrible had happened but couldn't quite grasp what. I told them they were murderers, Sarah said through her tears. I slapped him. I looked into that man's eyes and called him a liar and a murderer, and he was innocent. He was innocent, and I condemned him with my grief. No one tried to comfort her. What comfort could possibly be offered? The writer who'd brought the news stood awkwardly at the edge of the scene, clearly wishing he'd arrived earlier or later or never at all. Mr. Martin, sir, I should get back. Mr. Dalton will want to know that I delivered the message. Wait. Martin's voice was dull, distant. Tell Jacob. Tell him we made a terrible mistake. Tell him 3 innocent men died because we were too afraid to wait, too certain to doubt. Tell him yourself, the writer interrupted gently. He's asking for you, wants to understand what happened while he was unconscious. He'll hate me when he knows. Maybe, but he deserves to hear it from you, not secondhand. The writer moved toward his exhausted horse. The marshal's expected in Silver Creek tomorrow. He'll probably want to come here, investigate what happened. An investigation, Samuel said bitterly. How thorough, how proper. Too bad it's coming 3 days too late. The writer mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the darkness and leaving behind a town that would never be the same. People began to drift away slowly, moving like sleepwalkers through a nightmare they couldn't escape. Some went to their homes in silence. Others clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about what had happened, what it meant, how they'd live with it. Still others simply stood and stared at the 3 bodies laid out on the ground, as if looking long enough might somehow undo what had been done. Colt remained where he was, watching and remembering. This was Colorado all over again, the same script playing out in a different valley with different names, but the same terrible ending. Men dead who shouldn't be. A town fractured by the weight of collective guilt. The knowledge that no amount of regret or remorse could bring back what had been taken. Frank Hewitt approached him, his face haggard. "You knew," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't far from one. "From the start, you knew this would happen." "I suspected," Colt corrected. "I've seen it before. The pattern's always the same: fear, certainty, haste, regret. The names and places change, but the story stays the same. Why didn't you stop us?" "How?" Colt's voice was flat, emotionless. "By getting myself hanged alongside them. By giving speeches about patience and procedure that no one would hear over their own fear. I tried talking to people, Frank. So did Samuel. So did Iris. No one listened. No one wanted to listen. So you just watched? Just stood by and let it happen? What else was I supposed to do?" Colt turned to face him fully. "Tell me, Frank, what grand gesture would have changed the outcome? What words would have penetrated the certainty you all felt? You had your minds made up before those men ever spoke in their own defense." Frank flinched as if struck, but he didn't deny it. After a moment, he said, "What happens now?" "Now?" Colt looked around at the devastated town. "Now you live with it. You bury those men with whatever honors you can manage. You tell their families, if you can find them. You face the marshal and explain what you did and why. And then you wake up every morning for the rest of your lives knowing you hanged 3 innocent men because you were too afraid to wait for the truth. That's harsh. It's honest." Colt started walking toward the boarding house. "There's no redemption for this, Frank. No making it right. You can learn from it. You can try to be better. You can dedicate your lives to never letting it happen again. But you can't undo it. Those men are dead, and that's permanent." He left Frank standing there and made his way through the darkened streets. The town that had seemed merely harsh 4 days ago now felt cursed, poisoned by what had been done in its center. Light showed in windows, but they seemed dimmer somehow, as if the collective guilt had leached the brightness from everything. Iris Harmon was sitting on the boarding house porch when he arrived, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She looked up as he approached, her face showing every one of her years and then some. "You were right," she said, "about all of it." "I wish I'd been wrong." Colt sat beside her, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Being right doesn't help those 3 men. "Samuel's beside himself. He's talking about leaving Sweetwater, going somewhere else to teach. Says he can't stay in a place that did this. Might be wise. Towns have long memories for the people who oppose them, even when those people turn out to be right." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The creek continued its endless conversation with the stones. The mountains stood indifferent to human tragedy, as they always had and always would. "What will you do?" Iris asked finally. "Move on, same as always." Colt pulled out his tobacco and began rolling a cigarette with hands that were steadier than he felt. "Nothing keeping me here now." "You could stay. Help us figure out how to—" She stopped, seeming to realize the futility of the suggestion. "No, you're right. You should go. There's nothing but pain here now." "There was nothing but pain here before," Colt said gently. This just made it visible. Inside the boarding house, he could hear someone crying, low, broken sobs that spoke of guilt beyond bearing. He didn't ask who it was. It could have been anyone. By morning, it would probably be everyone. The night wore on. Colt sat on the porch and smoked and watched Sweetwater process what it had done. Doors opened and closed. Voices rose and fell. Somewhere someone was praying, though whether for forgiveness or guidance or simply release from the horror, he couldn't tell. Around midnight, Martin appeared, walking slowly through the empty street like a ghost haunting his own life. He stopped in front of the boarding house and looked up at Colt with eyes that held nothing but devastation. "You tried to warn us," Martin said. "That first day when we brought them in, you were there watching, and you knew. Knowing and stopping aren't the same thing." "No, I suppose not." Martin climbed the porch steps and sat heavily on the railing. "I'm going to Silver Creek tomorrow, going to tell Jacob what happened, what we did in his name." "That's brave." "It's necessary. He deserves to know. The families of those men deserve to know." Martin pulled the letter Elias had given him from his pocket, staring at it as if it might contain answers. This is addressed to his sister in Philadelphia, Elias Boone's sister. I promised I'd mail it. Then you should. What do I say when I include my own letter? How do I explain that her brother died begging us to wait, pleading for verification, and we killed him anyway because we were too certain to doubt? Martin's voice cracked. How do you put that into words? Colt had no answer. There were no words adequate to that task, no explanation that would make it comprehensible or forgivable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of irreversible choices. I thought I was doing the right thing, Martin said eventually. Every step of the way I believed I was serving justice, protecting the community, honoring Jacob's memory. How did I get it so wrong? You believed what you needed to believe, saw what you wanted to see, built certainty from fear and called it evidence. Colt finished his cigarette and ground it out carefully. It's the oldest human story there is, deciding first and finding justification after. But I'm not a bad man. I don't think I'm a bad man. Martin looked at his hands as if expecting to see blood there. I've lived my whole life trying to do right, to be fair, to treat people decently. How did I become the kind of person who hangs innocent men? You convinced yourself they weren't innocent. That's all it takes. Colt stood, preparing to go inside. The road to atrocity is paved with certainty, Martin. Remember that for whatever comes next. He left Martin sitting on the porch railing, still staring at the letter in his hands, and climbed the stairs to his room. The bed he'd barely slept in looked uninviting. The room itself felt suffocating. But he lay down anyway and stared at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness, he could see Elias Boone's face as clearly as if the man stood before him. Could hear Toby's terrified pleas, could see the foreign man's photograph of his wife and child, could feel the weight of witnessing without stopping, of knowing without preventing, of carrying forward into yet another day the burden of what humans were capable of when fear overcame reason. Dawn came eventually, as it always did, indifferent to human suffering. The sun rose over the eastern peaks and painted the valley in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful if not for what they illuminated. A town waking to the full reality of what it had done. The bodies of 3 innocent men waiting for burial, the beginning of a reckoning that would last far longer than anyone imagined. Colt rose with the sun and began packing his few belongings. There was nothing more for him here. No reason to stay and watch the slow dissolution of a community under the weight of its own guilt. He'd seen that play out in Colorado, didn't need to see it again. As he was checking out with Iris Harmon, Samuel Reed appeared at the boarding house door. The schoolteacher looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "You're leaving," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. "No reason to stay." "I wish I could do the same. Just pack up and move on. Leave this all behind." Samuel's laugh was bitter. "But someone needs to stay. Someone needs to remember them properly, to make sure this town never forgets what it did." "That's a heavy burden you're choosing. It's lighter than the alternative. Than forgetting. Than letting everyone pretend it wasn't as bad as it was, or that they had no choice, or that time will somehow make it better." Samuel handed Colt a piece of paper. "I wrote down their names. What we knew of them, at least. Thought you might want to remember them too." Colt took the paper and read. Elias Boone, carpenter and traveler, 53 years old, sister in Philadelphia. Toby Hale, ranch hand and apprentice, 19 years old, family unknown. Name unknown, approximately 40 years old, from somewhere in Eastern Europe, survived by wife and child. "I'll remember," Colt said, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. He left Sweetwater as the town was gathering to bury the 3 men they'd murdered. Rode south along the creek road, retracing the route that had brought him to the valley 4 days earlier. Behind him, he could hear the faint sound of voices raised in some semblance of ceremony. Too late, too hollow, too overwhelmed by guilt to matter. The valley narrowed, the mountains pressing close, and then he was through the gap and heading into open country where the world felt larger and the air less heavy with accumulated sin. But he carried it with him anyway, carried all of it. Colorado, Sweetwater, every other place where he'd watched fear triumph over reason and paid the price in innocent blood. Carried it forward into whatever came next, one more weight added to a burden that never seemed to get lighter. Behind him, Sweetwater began the long process of learning to live with itself. The process would take years, would fracture families and friendships, would drive some people away and trap others in cycles of guilt and recrimination. But that was their story now, their burden to bear. Colt Rayner just kept riding, always moving, never staying long enough to put down roots. Because roots meant attachment, and attachment meant caring, and caring meant watching it happen all over again. And he'd seen enough already to last several lifetimes. Colt had made it perhaps 10 miles south when he stopped. Russ sensed the hesitation before Colt fully acknowledged it himself, the gelding slowing from a trot to a walk without being asked. They stood in the middle of the trail as the morning sun climbed higher, painting the world in colors too bright for what Colt was feeling. He sat there for a long time, one hand resting on the letter Samuel had given him, the other holding Rust's reins loosely. The smart thing would be to keep riding, to put distance between himself and Sweetwater, to let the town deal with its own consequences while he moved on to wherever the trail took him next. That's what he'd done after Colorado. That's what he'd been doing for 5 years, but something had changed in those 4 days. Something had shifted in the watching and the witnessing, in the familiar horror of seeing it happen again. Running hadn't saved him in Colorado. It had only spread the poison across more territory, carried the guilt to new places without ever setting it down. Maybe, Colt thought, the problem wasn't that he kept finding himself in these situations. Maybe the problem was that he kept leaving before understanding what they meant. He turned Rust around and headed back north. The sun was high overhead when he rode back into Sweetwater. The town looked different in daylight, smaller, more exposed, like a wound laid bare. The hanging trees still stood at the edge of the main street, its branches empty now but marked forever by what had occurred beneath them. Someone had cut the ropes down, but the bark showed scars where the hemp had bitten deep during the night's terrible work. The burial was over. Fresh earth marked 3 graves in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town, set apart from the other plots, as if even in death, the 3 men remained outsiders. A few people still lingered there: Iris Harmon, Samuel Reed, and surprisingly, Sarah Dalton, who knelt at one of the graves with her head bowed. Colt tied Rust outside the boarding house and walked up the hill. The mourners looked up at his approach with varying expressions of surprise. Samuel's showed something that might have been hope. Iris's held a question. Sarah's was unreadable, her face a mask of grief and guilt that seemed to have aged her a decade overnight. "I thought you'd left," Samuel said quietly. "I did. Got about 10 miles before I realized running wasn't going to change anything." Colt removed his hat, holding it awkwardly as he looked at the 3 graves. Simple wooden markers bore the names Samuel had written down, along with the dates of their deaths. Someone had added a line beneath each name. "Died innocent, remembered always." "Martin's gone to Silver Creek," Iris said. "He left at dawn to face Jacob Dalton and explain what happened. Frank went with him." "And the others?" "Scattered. Some are hiding in their homes. Some are trying to pretend it didn't happen. A few are already talking about how it wasn't really their fault, how they were misled by Martin or confused by circumstances." Samuel's voice was bitter. "The fracturing has already begun. Give it a few months and you'll have a dozen different versions of last night, all designed to spread the blame thin enough that no one has to carry too much of it." Sarah Dalton stood, brushing dirt from her black dress. She looked at Colt with eyes that held depths of suffering he couldn't begin to fathom. "You're the stranger who tried to make them wait," she said. "The one who spoke at the trial." "I wouldn't call it a trial." "No, it wasn't." She glanced back at the graves. "Mr. Boone, Elias, he told me to my face that he was innocent. I slapped him, called him a liar. And now my husband lives while this man and his companions are dead, and I have to carry that knowledge for the rest of my life." "Your grief was real," Colt said carefully. "You believed your husband was dead. Belief doesn't excuse action. I helped create the atmosphere that killed them. My pain became permission for everyone else's certainty." She moved toward the path leading down from the cemetery. "I'm taking my children and leaving Sweetwater. I can't raise them in a place that did this, can't teach them right from wrong in a town that confused vengeance with justice." She walked away without waiting for a response, her spine straight despite the weight she carried. Colt watched her go and understood. Some people would stay and face what had been done, while others would leave to escape it. Neither choice would bring peace. "The marshal arrived an hour ago," Iris said after Sarah had disappeared down the hill. "He's at the stone building now, interviewing people, trying to piece together what happened." "What will he do? What can he do?" Samuel gestured helplessly at the graves. The crime's been committed. The victims are buried. He can write a report, document the failures, maybe recommend charges against Martin and the others who led the posse. But it won't bring those men back. Colt studied the graves, thinking about the letter in his pocket. Elias gave Martin a letter to mail to his sister. Martin still has it. Someone should make sure it actually gets sent. I'll handle it, Samuel said. I'm collecting all their belongings, what little there was. Planning to track down families if possible. Return what can be returned. That's good. That matters. Does it? Samuel's voice cracked. They're dead, Colt. We failed them. I failed them. I argued and pleaded and made my case, and it didn't matter at all. What good is trying to make things right after when you couldn't stop them from going wrong before? Colt sat down on a nearby stone, suddenly tired despite the morning hour. I asked myself that same question for 5 years. Never found a satisfying answer. But I think maybe the question itself is wrong. How do you mean? We keep asking what good it does after the fact, as if the only measure of worth is prevention. But most of the time we can't prevent. We're not strong enough, or smart enough, or convincing enough to stop fear once it gets momentum. So we do what we can with what's left. We remember accurately, we tell the truth, we try to extract meaning from tragedy, so maybe, somewhere down the line, someone else will make a different choice. That's cold comfort when you're standing at fresh graves, Iris said. It is, but it's all we've got. Colt looked up at them both. I came back because running taught me nothing except how to be alone with guilt. Maybe staying and facing it won't teach me anything either, but at least I'll find out. Samuel absorbed this for a moment, then nodded slowly. The marshal wants to speak with everyone who witnessed what happened. You should talk to him. The marshal was a weathered man in his late 50s named Thomas Garrett, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be shocked by Sweetwater's particular variety. He'd set up in the stone building's main room, using a makeshift desk to take statements and compile evidence for a report that everyone knew would be filed and forgotten in some territorial office. Colt found him interviewing Pete, the guard who'd been watching the prisoners the morning of the execution. Pete was describing the events with the detached tone of someone trying to distance himself from participation, and Marshal Garrett was noting it all down with patient efficiency. When Pete finished and left, looking relieved to have it over with, Garrett turned his attention to Colt. You're the one who wrote in the day they brought the prisoners back. Reiner, is it? Colt Reiner? Yes, sir. And you advocated for waiting, from what I understand. I did, along with Samuel Reed and a few others. Didn't make much difference. Garrett studied him with the keen assessment of a man trained to read people. You've seen this before, I can tell. You've got the look of someone who knows exactly how these things play out. Colorado, 5 years back. Different town, different names, same story. We hanged 3 men based on circumstantial evidence and certainty. Real killers confessed 2 weeks later. Colt met the marshal's eyes steadily. That's why I knew what would happen here. Pattern's always the same. And yet you couldn't stop it. No, sir. Fear's a powerful force. Once it gets moving, words don't slow it much. Garrett wrote something in his ledger, then set down his pen. I've been doing this job for 23 years, seen every variation of frontier justice you can imagine. And I'll tell you what I've learned. Most people are decent until they're scared. Then decency goes out the window and they become something else entirely. Not evil, exactly. Just desperate for control in an uncontrollable situation. Does that excuse what happened here? Not even slightly, but it explains it. The marshal leaned back in his chair. Martin's story matches everyone else's. They found 3 strangers at the wrong place at the wrong time, built a case from coincidence and confirmation bias, and executed them before facts could interfere with their certainty. Classic example of mob justice. Will there be charges? Against who? The whole town participated. I could arrest Martin as the ringleader, maybe Frank and a few others who were most vocal, but half of them would claim they were following community consensus. The other half would say they were opposed, but outvoted. And in the end, I'd have a trial that would tear this town apart even further while accomplishing nothing except spreading the guilt around more officially. So no one pays for what happened to those 3 men. Everyone pays, Garrett corrected. Just not in a courtroom. They'll pay in sleepless nights and fractured relationships, and the knowledge that they became the kind of people who murder innocents. That's punishment enough, though it won't feel like justice to anyone. Colt understood the calculus, even if he didn't like it. What happens to Sweetwater now? It survives or it doesn't. Some towns recover from things like this. They acknowledge what happened, take steps to ensure it never happens again, and move forward with the weight of their history but not crushed by it. Other towns rot from the inside out. People leave, businesses close. The whole thing just slowly dies. Garrett picked up his pen again. My guess? Sweetwater's in for hard times. The decent people will leave because they can't stomach what was done. The ones who stay will either be those too stubborn to admit they were wrong or too guilty to face the world elsewhere. Either way, this town's best days are behind it. The marshal's prediction proved accurate faster than anyone expected. Over the next several days, Colt watched Sweetwater begin its slow dissolution. Sarah Dalton left with her children on the third day, taking a wagon south toward relatives in Colorado. Samuel Reed announced he'd accepted a teaching position in Oregon and would be leaving within the month. Iris Harmon sold her boarding house to a speculator for half what it was worth and made plans to return to her family in Missouri. But others stayed, and the division between those who could live with what had been done and those who couldn't created fault lines that split the town like an earthquake. Arguments broke out in the streets over who had been most responsible, who had spoken against it, who had remained silent. Old friendships shattered. New alliances formed based on shared guilt or shared opposition. The hanging tree became a physical reminder of what the town had done, and people began avoiding that end of the street entirely. Proposals were made to cut it down, but every time the suggestion came up, someone would argue against it. Not out of sentiment, but because destroying the evidence felt too much like trying to erase what had happened. Martin returned from Silver Creek a broken man. Jacob Dalton had received the news of what had been done in his name with horror and rage, and had banished Martin from his presence. The real killers, Cassidy and Monroe, had laughed when they heard about the hanging, apparently finding it hilarious that Sweetwater had executed the wrong men. Martin spent his days sitting on the porch of the general store, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. He'd written to Elias Boone's sister in Philadelphia, trying to explain the inexplicable, and was waiting for a response that might never come. The letter Elias had written sat beside him always, still unmailed because Martin couldn't bring himself to send it without including his own explanation first. Colt found him there on the evening of the 5th day, still sitting, still staring. You should mail the letter, Colt said without preamble. His sister deserves to have his last words, even if your explanation isn't finished. Martin looked at him, with eyes that seemed to have lost the ability to focus properly. I've written 17 drafts. Can't seem to find words that don't sound like excuses or justifications. How do you tell someone their brother died begging for his life and you killed him anyway because you were too certain to doubt? You tell them the truth, plainly and without decoration. Then you live with whatever response comes back. Colt sat beside him. The letter isn't for you, Martin. It's for her. She's got a right to her brother's last words, and you're keeping them from her because you can't figure out how to make yourself feel better about what you did. The words landed hard, and Martin flinched. But after a moment, he nodded slowly. You're right. I'll mail it tomorrow. Both letters, however inadequate mine is. They sat in silence for a while, watching the town go through the motions of evening routine. But the routines felt hollow now, performed by people who were just going through familiar patterns because they didn't know what else to do. I keep seeing his face, Martin said eventually. Elias Boone? The way he looked at me when I gave the order to kick the chairs away. Not hatred, not even anger, just disappointment, like I'd failed some test he'd hoped I'd pass. You did fail. I know. Martin's voice was barely audible. I became exactly what he said I was becoming, someone who chose control over conscience, someone who confused certainty with truth, someone who killed innocent men rather than admit he might be wrong. That knowledge going to change how you act going forward? I don't know. I'd like to think so. I'd like to believe this taught me something about the danger of certainty, about the necessity of doubt, about choosing patience over fear. But I thought I was a good man before all this too, and look what I did. Martin turned to face Colt directly. How do you trust your own judgment after something like this? How do you make decisions when you know you're capable of being so catastrophically wrong? Colt thought about the question, really considered it. You don't trust your judgment alone. You build in checks, other voices, other perspectives, requirements for verification before action. You make yourself wait even when waiting feels wrong. You choose the slower path that leaves room for correction over the fast path that can't be undone. He paused. And you remember. You keep the weight of what you did close enough that it informs every choice going forward. Not so close it crushes you, but close enough to matter. That sounds like a life sentence. It is, but it's the one you've got now. On the seventh day, Colt stood with Samuel at the three graves one final time. The school teacher was leaving the next morning, his belongings already packed. He'd found addresses for Toby Hale's distant family in Kansas and had shipped them the boy's few possessions along with a letter explaining what had happened. The foreign man's photograph and leather pouch were going to a priest in Silver Creek who'd promised to try to track down the family through immigrant networks. Elias's belongings were being sent to his sister, along with both letters. "I'm glad you came back," Samuel said. "I thought I was going to be alone in remembering them properly." "You're not alone. Iris will remember. A few others who opposed it will remember. Even some who participated will remember, though their memories will be complicated by guilt." Colt placed a stone on each grave, a marker of visitation. "The question is what we do with the remembering." "What do you mean?" "Remembering can be passive, just carrying the weight and letting it weigh you down. Or it can be active, using the knowledge to make different choices, to speak up earlier, to choose doubt over certainty when it matters." Colt straightened, looking out over the valley. "I spent 5 years doing passive remembering, just carrying Colorado around like a stone in my gut. Didn't help anyone, including me. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out what active remembering looks like. What it means to let this inform how I live instead of just what I regret." Samuel considered this. "I think that's why I'm going to Oregon. Not to escape, but to apply what I learned here. To teach my students about the dangers of certainty, about mob mentality, about the importance of procedure and patience. To make something constructive from something horrible." "That's good. That's important." Colt offered his hand. "You did well here, Sam. You spoke up when it mattered, even knowing it wouldn't change the outcome. That took courage." Samuel shook his hand, then pulled him into an unexpected embrace. "Thank you for coming back, for witnessing, for being someone who understood." He stepped back, his eyes wet. "I hope you find what you're looking for, wherever the trail takes you." "I hope you do too." Colt left Sweetwater for the second time 2 days later, but this departure felt different from the first. He wasn't running now. He was choosing to move on, which wasn't the same thing. He'd spent the previous days helping where he could, assisting with the final settlement of the dead men's affairs, speaking to people who needed to process what had happened, sitting with Martin through one long night when the guilt threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He'd also spent time thinking about what came next, not just where he'd ride, but what he'd do when he got there. The pattern of his last 5 years had been to arrive in a town, stay briefly, and move on before putting down roots. But maybe that pattern was part of the problem. Maybe real change required committing to a place long enough to make a difference, to build the relationships that allowed for influence when crisis came. As he rode south out of the valley, he passed the cemetery one last time. Someone had been there recently. Fresh flowers lay on all 3 graves, and the wooden markers had been reinforced against the weather. The town might be dying, but some people were ensuring the memory of what had happened would outlast Sweetwater itself. The trail took him through the same narrow gap in the mountains where he'd first entered the valley 9 days earlier. But the world beyond looked different now, or maybe he was seeing it differently. The mountains seemed less menacing, the valley less cursed. They were just geography, just land. It was humans who brought meaning and consequence to places. Humans who created tragedy through their choices. 10 miles south, he stopped at the same spot where he'd turned around before. This time, he didn't hesitate. He kept riding, but with a different purpose than simple escape. He was carrying something forward now, not just guilt and regret, but also understanding. The knowledge that fear was powerful but not inevitable. That mob mentality could be resisted, even if the resistance failed. That bearing witness mattered, even when it couldn't prevent tragedy. He'd failed to save Elias Boone, Toby Hale, Colt, and the unnamed foreign man. would carry that failure alongside his Colorado ghost for however many years remained to him. But maybe that carrying could become something more than just weight. Maybe it could become wisdom, hard-earned and blood-bought, but real nonetheless. 3 weeks later, Colt arrived in a small mining town called Silver Ridge, about 80 miles southwest of Sweetwater. The town was smaller, rougher, younger than the place he'd left. It had the raw energy of a settlement still figuring out what it would become, still establishing the patterns and practices that would define it. He took a room at the only hotel and spent his first few days observing, watching how disputes were settled, how power flowed, how the town dealt with strangers and uncertainty. What he saw was familiar, the same dynamics that had played out in Sweetwater and Colorado, the same human tendencies toward fear and certainty. But he also saw opportunity. Silver Ridge was young enough that patterns weren't yet set in stone. The town had no established justice system, no clear leader, no fixed way of handling crises. That meant it was vulnerable to the kind of mob justice that had killed 3 men in Sweetwater. But it also meant there was space to build something better, to establish different practices before the bad ones took root. On his 4th evening in Silver Ridge, a fight broke out between 2 miners over a disputed claim. The conflict escalated quickly, drawing a crowd that seemed ready to take sides and let violence settle the matter. Colt watched it building and recognized the pattern. The same energy, the same rush to judgment, the same certainty about who was right and who deserved punishment. This time, he didn't just watch. He stepped into the center of the conflict, positioning himself between the 2 angry miners. "Before this goes further, let me tell you a story," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "about a town called Sweetwater, and 3 men who died there 9 days ago." The crowd's attention shifted to him, curiosity temporarily overriding anger. Colt took the moment and ran with it. Those 3 men were hanged for murder and theft. The whole town was certain they were guilty. All the evidence pointed to them: timing, description, location. They held a trial, took a vote, executed them at dawn. Quick justice, everyone said. Necessary justice. He paused, letting the silence build. The next morning, they found out the men they'd hanged were innocent. The real killers had already been caught and confessed. And that town, good people, decent people, had to live with the knowledge that they'd murdered 3 innocent men because they were too certain to doubt, too afraid to wait, too convinced they were right to consider they might be wrong. The crowd had gone still. The 2 miners who'd been ready to fight looked uncertain now, their anger complicated by the story's implications. "I'm not saying your dispute doesn't matter," Colt continued. "I'm saying that deciding who's right when you're angry is dangerous. Certainty is dangerous. Speed is dangerous. Sometimes the brave thing isn't choosing a side. It's choosing to wait until the truth becomes clear." One of the miners spoke up. "So what are you suggesting? That we just let it sit unresolved?" "I'm suggesting you get a neutral party to examine both claims. Give each of you a chance to present your case when you're calm instead of furious. Make a decision based on evidence instead of emotion." Colt looked around at the crowd. "And I'm suggesting that this town needs to establish some basic practices for handling disputes before someone gets killed over something that could have been resolved with patience." There was muttering in the crowd, some agreeing, some skeptical. But the immediate energy had dissipated. The rush to violence had been interrupted, and in that interruption, space opened for different choices. An older man stepped forward, someone who carried himself with the authority of long residence. "The stranger's got a point. We've been operating on improvisation and might makes right for too long. Time we set up some basic rules, some way of settling things that doesn't always end in bloodshed." "Who made him the authority?" someone challenged, pointing at Colt. "He just rode in. What does he know about our town?" "He knows what happens when towns don't have systems in place," the older man replied. "I'm inclined to listen. You all can do what you want." The crowd broke up gradually. The crisis diffused, if not fully resolved. The 2 miners agreed to bring their dispute before a committee that would be formed to examine the competing claims. It wasn't perfect resolution, but it was better than violence. Colt found the older man afterward. "Thank you for the support. Name's Henry Walsh. I run the assay office." The man offered his hand. "That story about Sweetwater, that really happened?" "Every word. I was there. Watched the whole thing unfold." Henry studied him carefully. You looking to stay in Silver Ridge or just passing through? Depends, man. Is there room for someone trying to help build better systems before the bad ones take hold? I think there might be. Henry smiled slightly. Town's young enough to establish good practices if someone's willing to push for them. But it'll be an uphill fight. People resist structure until they've suffered enough without it. I know. But maybe if we start now, we can prevent some of that suffering. They talked long into the night, and by the time Colt returned to his hotel, he'd made a decision. He would stay in Silver Ridge, at least for a while, would help Henry and others who were interested in establishing basic frameworks for justice and dispute resolution. Would use what he'd learned in Colorado and Sweetwater to try to prevent the same tragedies from playing out here. It might not work. Probably wouldn't, if he was being honest. Human nature didn't change just because someone told cautionary tales. Fear would still triumph over reason more often than not. Mob mentality would still pull people towards certainty when doubt was needed. But maybe, occasionally, in specific moments, the lessons of Sweetwater would make a difference. Maybe one dispute would be resolved peacefully that would have turned violent. Maybe one rush to judgment would be slowed long enough for facts to catch up. Maybe one innocent person would be spared because someone remembered what happened to Elias Boone, Toby Hale, and the unnamed foreign man. That wouldn't redeem what had been done, wouldn't bring the dead back or absolve the guilt of those who'd killed them. But it would mean their deaths weren't entirely without meaning. That tragedy had produced something beyond just more tragedy. Colt sat in his hotel room that night and took out the piece of paper Samuel had given him, the one with the 3 names written in careful script. He'd carried it in his pocket since leaving Sweetwater, a physical reminder of what he was trying to prevent from happening again. He added it to another piece of paper he carried, the one from Colorado with 3 different names. 3 different men who'd died the same way for the same reasons. 6 names total now, 6 ghosts who traveled with him, 6 reasons to try to do better. He knew there would probably be more names eventually. The pattern was too old, too embedded in human nature to ever fully break. Fear would always be powerful. Certainty would always be seductive. Mob mentality would always provide the comfort of shared responsibility, but maybe the number of names would be smaller than it would have been otherwise. Maybe some valleys would avoid Sweetwater's fate because someone stood up at the right moment with the right story and made people pause long enough to choose differently. That was all he could hope for. All anyone could hope for, really, that the weight they carried would eventually inform the choices they made, that suffering would produce wisdom, that tragedy would teach lessons worth learning. Outside his window, Silver Ridge settled into sleep. The mountains stood silent guard over the valley. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama. Somewhere far to the north, Sweetwater continued its slow dissolution, a town dying from the weight of what it had done to itself. And in his small hotel room, a drifter who'd decided to stop drifting sat and thought about the future, about building instead of just witnessing, about prevention instead of just remembrance, about choosing to stay and face the hard work of making things better rather than running and hoping distance would bring peace. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible, but for the first time in 5 years, Colt Reiner felt something other than guilt and regret. He felt purpose. He felt the weight of 6 names transforming from burden into mission. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving. Men did terrible things when fear overcame conscience. Justice and vengeance were easily confused when grief demanded satisfaction. None of that would change because one man decided to stop running and start building. But maybe, just maybe, in one small mining town, in one specific moment, the lessons learned in blood in Sweetwater, Montana territory would prevent another tragedy, would save one life that would otherwise be lost to mob certainty and collective fear. That wouldn't be redemption, but it would be something. And something Colt was learning was better than the nothing that came from running away. He folded the paper with the 6 names and placed it carefully in his pocket, right over his heart, where he'd feel its weight constantly. Then he extinguished the lamp and lay down in the darkness, listening to Silver Ridge breathe around him. Tomorrow, he would start the work of building systems and establishing practices. Would begin the long, difficult process of teaching a young town how to choose patience over fear, doubt over certainty, procedure over immediate satisfaction. Tonight, he simply remembered, honored the 6 names he carried, acknowledged the weight, and accepted it not as punishment but as responsibility. The valley that had almost broken him had instead remade him, not into something without scars or guilt, but into something that could use those scars and that guilt constructively. Not running from the past, but carrying it forward as education, as warning, as the hard-won wisdom that came from witnessing what happened when good people convinced themselves that terrible things were necessary. In the darkness, Colt whispered 6 names, 3 from Colorado, 3 from Sweetwater. Promised them that their deaths would mean something beyond just tragedy, that he would carry their stories forward and tell them when they needed telling, that the weight of what had been done to them would become the lever that moved future choices toward something better. It was a small promise in a vast and uncaring universe, but it was all he had to give, and so he gave it freely and completely. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Silver Ridge and painted the world in colors too bright for what he carried, Colt Rayner rose with it and began the work of ensuring that this valley, at least, would not repeat Sweetwater's mistakes. The work of a lifetime, probably. The work that would define whatever years remained to him. The work that transformed witness into advocate, regret into purpose, and the terrible knowledge of what humans were capable of into determination that they could also be capable of better. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't peace, but it was a start. And sometimes, in the harsh and unforgiving frontier, a start was all you could ask for.